"This looks like a grave." Those are the words no officer ever expects to say, especially not while standing in the middle of a quiet forest, just 100 yards from an abandoned car. At first it looks like nothing. Just leaves. Dirt. A rock placed almost deliberately. But buried beneath that shallow pile is a truth so disturbing that it will expose not just one murder, but 20 years of violence, manipulation, and a man who learned how to get away with it. Because the woman found here didn't just disappear. She was hunted, deceived, and silenced by someone she once trusted. What begins as a missing mother, last seen texting about a date with a man who may not even exist, will unravel into a case filled with lies, impersonation, domestic terror, and a confession so calculated it nearly works. And the most terrifying part? The killer didn't run. He didn't hide. He invited police into his home, and almost convinced them he was the victim. Stay with this story until the end, because every detail you're about to hear matters. And the final truth is far darker than anyone expected. Before we dive in, subscribe to the channel for in-depth true crime stories, told with facts, context, and respect. With that said, this is one of the most disturbing cases we've ever covered. The call that started everything.
The forest is quiet in the kind of way that feels wrong. No wind. No birds. Just the sound of boots pressing down on damp leaves as officers scan the tree line. Ahead of them, partially hidden between the trunks, sits a car that doesn't belong there. No skid marks. No signs of a crash. Just a vehicle abandoned in the middle of nowhere, as if whoever left it simply stepped out and vanished. At this moment, the officers don't know what they're about to find. They don't know that this car will lead them to the most horrifying discovery of their careers. And they certainly don't know that what begins here will unravel into a story stretching back more than 2 decades, one filled with domestic violence, manipulation, impersonation, and a man who learned how to slip through the cracks again and again. But all of that comes later. Because this story doesn't start in the forest. It starts with a phone call. Just after sunrise, dispatch receives a request for a deputy. The caller's voice is shaky, controlled, but strained in a way that immediately raises concern. She explains that her best friend is missing, that she never showed up for work, that the last message anyone received from her was a text sent to her boss saying she was on her way. She never arrived. And now there are strange messages, texts that don't quite make sense. Within 25 minutes, a Montgomery County Sheriff's deputy is on the way to speak with the caller in person. At the time, it sounds like a missing persons case. Concerning, but not unheard of. People disappear all the time. Phones die. Plans change. Adults leave voluntarily. But as the deputy listens, the details begin stacking up in a way that makes this feel different. The missing woman's name is Crystal Hannah. She's 44 years old. A mother. A grandmother. Reliable. Dependable. The kind of person who doesn't just vanish without a word. Her friend explains that Crystal went out the night before with someone, a man she'd mentioned casually, almost in passing. Nothing seemed unusual at the time. But now her van is missing. No one knows where she is. And there's one detail that won't stop echoing in the caller's mind. Crystal has an abusive ex. That single sentence shifts the tone of the entire conversation. Officers know this pattern. A missing vehicle. A controlling former partner. A mysterious date the night before. None of those details alone mean much. But together, they form the outline of something that could turn dark very quickly. While one deputy heads to Crystal's home to conduct a welfare check, another reaches out to Crystal's daughter, Chelsea, hoping to learn more about the man her mother was supposed to meet. Chelsea's voice trembles as she explains the last messages she exchanged with her mom. The final text came just after 8 the night before. Crystal told her she loved her, said she might be going out, left instructions about where to leave the key. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned the man's name. Matt. She didn't want anyone to say anything, especially not her ex. She warned that she might not have service. And she added one more detail that now feels impossible to ignore. He lives on Knob Road. There was no address. Just a road. Just a name. And a growing sense of dread. As deputies relay this information back to detectives, another officer arrives at Crystal's home. No one answers the door. Her van is gone. There are no signs of a struggle, but there's also no sign of Crystal. Back at the station, detectives begin calling family members, friends, co-workers, anyone who might suggest that Crystal left willingly. What they hear instead paints a very different picture. Crystal was trusting, kind, almost naive at times. She showed up when people needed her. She wouldn't disappear and leave behind her children and grandchild without saying a word. By the time night falls, investigators know the first 24 hours are critical. So they focus on the strongest lead they have. The man named Matt. After hours of digging through records and filtering through multiple people with the same name, they finally find him. And when he answers the phone, everything takes a strange turn. He confirms that he once lived on Knob Road, but says he moved out of state years ago. He now lives in North Carolina. More importantly, He insists he has no idea who Crystal Hannah is. He claims he never spoke to her, never went on a date, never exchanged messages. Detectives are stunned. Their best lead is suddenly more than 100 miles away and denying everything. But something about the conversation doesn't sit right. So while they begin verifying his alibi, they turn their attention to the social media account Crystal had been messaging, the one she believed belonged to Matt. An emergency request is filed. Login records come back. Every single login traces back to the same place. Not North Carolina. A small town in Virginia. Elliston. That's when investigators realize the truth may be far worse than they imagined. The man Crystal thought she was talking to may never have existed at all. She may have been communicating with someone using a stolen identity. Someone close. Someone who knew her well enough to manipulate her trust. With that realization, detectives request Crystal's phone location data. The final ping comes back at 9:50 a.m. on Peddler Road, just 3 miles from the home of Crystal's ex-boyfriend, James Hunter Stallard. At this point, the case shifts from worrying to terrifying, because now the timeline is tightening. The lies are stacking up, and the person most likely to have hurt Crystal isn't a stranger in the woods. It's someone she already knew, and while detectives don't realize it yet, they are less than a mile away from the truth.
The man who should have been gone.
By the time detectives receive the final phone ping from Crystal's device, the case has already crossed an invisible line. This is no longer a missing person investigation driven by hope and uncertainty. This is a race against time, guided by geography, lies, and a man whose name keeps resurfacing no matter which direction investigators turn. James Hunter Stallard. Crystal's ex-boyfriend. The man her daughter was afraid of. The man Crystal warned others about. The man who, according to the data, was just 3 miles away when Crystal's phone went silent. But proximity alone is not proof. And detectives know better than to rush in without understanding exactly who they're dealing with. So they slow down. They pull records. They dig through past police reports. They talk quietly among themselves as a picture begins to form. One that explains why Crystal's name appears so often next to James in incident logs, welfare checks, and domestic calls. The relationship wasn't just turbulent. It was volatile. On again, off again. Fueled by control, fear, and emotional manipulation. Yet despite all of that, James had never faced consequences severe enough to stop him. Which makes this moment especially dangerous. Because now, if Crystal really was near James' home that morning, detectives have to assume one thing above all else. If she's in trouble, it's happening right now. It's nearly 1 a.m. when investigators decide they can't wait any longer. They gather their gear and head straight to James' house, unsure of what they'll find. They don't know if Crystal is inside. They don't know if James is alone. They don't know if they're about to walk into a volatile confrontation. What they do know is that they can't afford to hesitate. As they pull up to the property, the atmosphere immediately feels different. The house is quiet. The surrounding area is dark, isolated, and still. Officers approach carefully, hands close to their belts, scanning the shadows as they knock. James answers the door. He appears calm, almost relaxed. He greets them politely, even casually, as if he's been expecting them. There's no visible panic, no agitation, no obvious signs that something is wrong. And that alone makes investigators uneasy. They introduce themselves, explain that Crystal is missing, ask if he's spoken to her recently. James tells them it's been 2 days since he last saw her. He struggles to recall specifics. Days blur together, he says. Time gets confusing. But when detectives begin clarifying the timeline, walking him through dates, times, and phone data, his story begins to wobble. 2 days becomes 1. Friday becomes Sunday. Confidence gives way to hesitation. Then detectives show him something he can't explain away. Crystal's phone ping. They point out the cell tower, the distance, the box drawn around his house. They explain that Crystal's phone was active just 3 miles away that morning. James looks genuinely surprised. At least, that's how it appears. He insists he knows nothing about it. Says Crystal must have stopped nearby briefly. Claims she didn't come inside. Suggests she may have just used her phone and left. His answers aren't aggressive. They aren't defensive. They're vague. And that makes them dangerous. Despite the inconsistencies, James does something unexpected. He invites the officers inside. Offers to let them search the house. Tells them they can look anywhere they want. To the untrained eye, this looks cooperative. Reassuring, even. But seasoned investigators know that cooperation can be just another form of control. Inside the house, officers find nothing immediately alarming. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No evidence that Crystal was harmed there, at least nothing visible. James explains that Crystal had been in and out of his life, that she left belongings behind, that the relationship was complicated. He mentions her mental health, suggests she struggled emotionally, implies that she might disappear sometimes, that she might turn off her phone. Each statement subtly shifts responsibility away from him. And for now, it works. With no hard evidence and no immediate cause for arrest, detectives leave the house just as quietly as they arrived. Another night passes, without answers. Another opportunity slips by. But less than 5 hours later, everything changes. At 5 a.m., a patrol officer is dispatched to investigate an abandoned car found deep in the forest. It's not uncommon. Stolen vehicles get dumped all the time. At first glance, there's nothing remarkable about it, until the officer runs the plates. The car belongs to Crystal Hannah. The forest suddenly feels different. Backup is called. Detectives arrive. The area is sealed off as officers fan out, searching for any sign of where Crystal might have gone after leaving her vehicle. That's when they see it. Blood on the leaves. Drag marks in the dirt. The trail doesn't go far. And it doesn't wander. It leads with purpose, straight to a small mound covered in leaves. A rock placed on top. Flowers arranged carefully, almost respectfully. One officer stops. This looks like a grave. The forensic team is called in immediately. As they remove the leaves, the truth emerges. Crystal's body is beneath them, decomposing, mold already forming. She didn't walk away. She didn't disappear. She was killed. The cause of death becomes clear as the examination continues. Blunt force trauma to the head, followed by strangulation. This is no longer about finding Crystal. It's about finding who did this to her. As the scene is secured, a man approaches, claiming to own the property where the body was found. He introduces himself politely, cooperates fully. His name is Skip Jackson. What detectives don't realize, at least not yet, is that they've just spoken to James' stepfather. And unknowingly, they've handed James something priceless. Time.
The truth they couldn't ignore.
The news reaches Crystal's family before it reaches the public. A phone call, a pause that lasts just a second too long, and then the words that permanently divide their lives into before and after. Crystal Hannah is dead. For her daughter, Chelsea, the world collapses inward. There is no room for shock, only grief, rage, and the unbearable weight of knowing that everything she feared actually happened. For months, she had warned people about James. She had begged her mother to stay away. She had lived with the constant anxiety that one day, something irreversible would happen. Now it has. Detectives understand that the hours following a death like this are delicate. Families are fragile. Emotions are raw. But they also know that this is often when the truth finally surfaces, when fear gives way to urgency, and silence breaks under the weight of loss. So they ask to speak with Crystal's family. Chelsea agrees. She sits across from investigators, barely holding herself together, and begins to describe the man her mother once loved, and the nightmare that love became. She talks about the violence, the hospital visits, the bruises that were hidden beneath clothing, the oxygen mask placed over her mother's face because she could barely breathe after one beating. She talks about the bald patch James left behind when he ripped her mother's hair out, about the chipped teeth, about her mother's face smashed into concrete. And then she talks about the threats. James didn't just hurt Crystal. He promised worse. He told them that they were all going to pay, that he would put Crystal and her own mother 6 feet under. He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it in anger and take it back. He said it like a plan. Chelsea admits she deleted the messages. At the time, she never imagined she'd need them as evidence. No one ever expects to need proof that someone they love will be murdered. By the end of the interview, the room is silent. Investigators don't need to look at each other to know what this means. James Hunter Stallard is no longer just a possibility. He is their prime suspect. As the day goes on, detectives work methodically. They gather records. They document statements. They prepare the groundwork for an arrest they know is coming. It's no longer a question of if, it's when. But before they can move, something unexpected happens. At around 5 in the morning, James calls them. Not to deny anything. Not to demand a lawyer. Not to ask questions. He asks to talk. In person. Investigators exchange looks. They already understand why. James knows the body has been found. His stepfather owns the land. Word has traveled faster than the official process ever could. James knows the walls are closing in. When detectives arrive at his house, James doesn't waste time. There's no small talk. No confusion. No performance of ignorance. He looks at them and says the words that change everything. I messed up. At first, it sounds vague, almost accidental. But as he continues, the meaning becomes clear. He talks about arguing, about things getting heated, about losing control. And then he says it. She's dead. There is no shouting. No dramatic breakdown. Just a quiet confession delivered with startling calm. For investigators, it's unexpected, but not shocking. They've seen this before. A man who believes he can control the narrative by admitting just enough to shape how the story ends. James is placed in custody without resistance. As he's transported to the station, detectives begin preparing for what they know is coming next. Because a confession like this is never the end. It's the beginning of a new strategy. And James has been running this playbook for years. Before the interrogation even begins, the lead detective does his homework. What he finds is disturbing but not surprising. James' history of violence doesn't start with Crystal. It stretches back nearly 2 decades. Felonious assaults, aggravated malicious wounding, repeated domestic abuse. In one case, he assaulted his own mother during an argument, forcing her face into the dirt. In another, he manipulated a situation involving Crystal's daughter so thoroughly that he was recorded as the victim, despite evidence to the contrary. Again and again, James escaped real consequences. Not because he wasn't violent, but because he knew how to manipulate the system. By the time the interrogation begins, detectives understand exactly who they're dealing with. A man who weaponizes emotion, self-pity, and selective honesty to avoid accountability. And that's exactly what he does. James talks about love, about heartbreak, about betrayal. He describes the relationship as toxic, but frames himself as the one who suffered most. He talks about weight loss, about starving himself, about pain so deep it nearly destroyed him. He says Crystal cheated, that she broke him, that he loved her more than anyone he'd ever loved before. And then, slowly, carefully, he begins to describe the day she died. He admits to hitting her, admits to pushing her down, admits to choking her. Not in a moment of panic, but in a sequence. He explains how he moved her body, how he covered her with leaves, how he placed a rock on top like a headstone, how he left flowers because, in his words, he didn't want to be disrespectful. The room stays quiet, because this isn't remorse. It's control. James believes that by explaining himself, by showing emotion, by claiming mental illness, he can soften what he's done. That he can turn murder into tragedy. That he can make himself the victim of his own actions. But this time, it doesn't work. When James asks for a psychiatrist, when he claims bipolar disorder, PTSD, explosive disorder, investigators listen calmly. They let him talk. And then they end the interview. Because they already have everything they need. And for the first time in his life, James Hunter Stallard doesn't get to walk away.
The confession that wasn't what it seemed.
By the time James Hunter Stallard sits down in the interrogation room, the outcome feels inevitable. He's already confessed. He's already admitted Crystal is dead. He's already described what he did to her. On the surface, this looks like the rarest kind of case. One where the suspect folds quickly, where the truth comes out without resistance, where justice moves fast. But detectives know better. Because men like James don't confess out of guilt. They confess out of strategy. The room is quiet. No raised voices. No accusations. The lead detective speaks calmly, almost gently, setting a tone that feels more like a conversation than an interrogation. This is intentional. James doesn't respond well to pressure. He responds to validation. And he takes the bait immediately. He starts talking about love. About how deeply he loved Crystal. About how no one understands the bond they shared. He calls it intense. Passionate. The strongest love he's ever known. He describes their relationship as toxic, but only in the sense that it hurt him. He paints himself as the man who gave everything and got nothing in return. Then he shifts. He talks about betrayal. About suspicion. About Crystal's phone. He says he knew she was cheating. That he didn't have proof, but he could feel it. That when he took her phone and saw messages, something inside him snapped. This is the moment James wants investigators to focus on. Not the violence. Not the pattern. But the trigger. He wants them to believe this was a crime of passion. A tragic explosion. A single moment where emotions ran too high. So detectives let him talk. They don't interrupt when he talks about starving himself. About losing weight. About carving her name into his skin to prove his devotion. They don't challenge him when he describes himself as broken, cursed, destroyed by love. Because beneath the self-pity, James is giving them exactly what they need. Details. He admits he hit Crystal, then clarifies that he pushed her down, then admits he beat her. The language shifts as the truth leaks out piece by piece. He describes how she kept demanding her phone back, how she wouldn't stop, how that made him angrier. And then quietly he says it. I choked her out. There's no hesitation, no confusion, just a statement. Detectives slow everything down. They ask him to explain. Was it his hand? Both hands? How long did it last? What happened next? James answers. He describes moving her body, carrying her, transporting her to the forest. He explains how he covered her with leaves and sticks, how he placed a rock on top like a marker, how he left flowers because, in his mind, that meant he still cared. To James, this isn't a confession of murder. It's a story of heartbreak. And that's the most disturbing part. Because even now, even after killing her, James centers himself. His pain, his loss, his suffering. Crystal becomes secondary, almost abstract. A character in his tragedy. When detectives push slightly, asking about intent, about awareness, James pivots again. This time, toward mental illness. He lists diagnoses rapidly. Bipolar disorder, PTSD, ADHD, intermittent explosive disorder. He says he hears voices, that he isn't in control, that he needs help. This isn't panic. It's calculation. James knows the system. He knows what words to use. He knows that mental instability introduces delays, evaluations, questions of competency, time. And time has always been his greatest weapon. Detectives listen. They don't argue. They don't dismiss him. They simply note everything and end the interrogation. James is placed in custody. He believes he's done enough, that he's shown remorse, that he's explained himself, that the worst is over. But outside that room, investigators are connecting dots James didn't expect them to see. Because when they look at his history, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't a break. This wasn't an episode. This wasn't sudden. It was escalation. Again and again, James used violence to regain control. Again and again, he framed himself as the victim. Again and again, he avoided real consequences by shifting blame to partners, to circumstances, to his own mental health. And now, for the first time, that pattern ends with a body. A body buried just miles from his home. A body that tells the truth James tried to bury with leaves and flowers. By the end of the night, detectives are no longer wondering what happened. They're asking something far more chilling. How many times did this man almost do this before and get away with it?
Inside the mind he tried to hide behind.
After the confession, James Hunter Stallard believes he has done exactly what he needed to do. He has admitted just enough. He has shown emotion without accepting responsibility. And most importantly, he has planted the seed of doubt. Mental illness. To James, this is not an afterthought. It is the cornerstone of his defense. From his jail cell, he begins preparing for the next phase, not the trial, but the evaluation. He knows that before a jury ever hears a story, doctors will. Psychologists, psychiatrists, experts trained to separate illness from intention. And James intends to convince them that he is not a killer, but a man overtaken by a mind he cannot control. He tells anyone who will listen that he hears voices, that his thoughts race uncontrollably, that he blacks out during moments of stress, that he doesn't remember everything that happened to Crystal, only fragments, images, sensations. At times, his behavior seems erratic. He rocks back and forth. He cries suddenly. He speaks in spirals, jumping from love to rage to despair in a single breath. But what no one tells James is this. Mental illness doesn't excuse patterns. And patterns are exactly what evaluators are trained to look for. During his first clinical interview, James leans heavily into chaos. He exaggerates symptoms. He piles diagnoses on top of diagnoses. Bipolar disorder, PTSD, ADHD, dissociative episodes. He paints a picture of a man constantly at war with his own mind. The evaluator listens quietly, then asks simple questions. Questions James doesn't expect. Questions about timelines, about consistency, about past behavior, about what happens before the anger and after the violence. And that's where cracks begin to form. Because when James talks about Crystal, his memory sharpens. He remembers details with clarity. What she said, how she looked, where she stood, how long the argument lasted. He remembers planning, decisions, sequences, control. When asked about the burial, he recalls choosing the location, covering the body, Placing the rock. Leaving flowers. These are not the actions of a man in a dissociative blackout. They are the actions of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and why. Over multiple sessions, a pattern emerges. James is calm when discussing logistics, agitated only when discussing accountability. He becomes emotional when talking about how the crime affects him, how lonely he feels, how misunderstood he is, how unfair life has been. But when Crystal is mentioned as a victim, when her suffering is centered, his emotion flattens. His voice steadies. His language becomes clinical. That emotional asymmetry doesn't go unnoticed. Evaluators also review his history. Police reports, prior arrests, domestic violence complaints, restraining orders. Each one tells the same story. Escalation followed by justification. Anger followed by apology. Violence followed by self-pity. And always someone else to blame. By the time the psychological report is finalized, the conclusion is devastating to James' defense. Yes, he has mental health issues. Yes, he struggles with emotional regulation. But no, he is not insane. And no, he was not out of control. He understood his actions. He understood their consequences. And he acted with intent. When James is informed of the findings, something changes. The frantic instability disappears. In its place is anger. He lashes out at attorneys, accuses the system of being rigged, claims the doctors lied, that they misunderstood him, that no one ever listens. But this time, there's no leverage left. The court deems him competent to stand trial, which means James will have to face a jury, not as a victim of his mind, but as a man responsible for his choices. And for the first time since Crystal vanished, the narrative is no longer his to control. Because soon, prosecutors will tell a different story. One where love is not the motive. Jealousy is not the excuse. Mental illness is not the shield. Only violence. Only control. Only the truth James tried and failed to hide behind a diagnosis.
When the story stopped belonging to him.
By the time the trial date is set, James Hunter Stallard understands something he has never truly faced before. This time, he is not the loudest voice in the room. For most of his life, James controlled the narrative. In relationships, in police encounters, even in his confession, he decided how events were framed, who was hurt, who was misunderstood, who deserved sympathy. But courtrooms are built to strip that power away. And from the very first day, prosecutors make it clear, this trial will not be about James' emotions, his diagnoses, or his version of love. It will be about Crystal. They begin where James never wanted anyone to look, at the pattern. Not just what happened the night Crystal died, but everything that led to it. The jealousy, the isolation, the control disguised as affection, the escalation of violence that had followed him from relationship to relationship. Prosecutors lay out a timeline that feels methodical, almost surgical. Each event on its own might seem survivable. An argument, a threat, a shove, an apology. But stacked together, they tell a different story. A story of inevitability. Witnesses describe Crystal in the weeks before her disappearance. Tired, anxious, on edge. They talk about how she checked her phone constantly, how she tried to keep the peace, how she seemed afraid to leave, but equally afraid to stay. The prosecution never raises their voice. They don't need to, because the evidence speaks steadily and without emotion, something James never learned how to do. They introduce phone records, messages, deleted texts recovered by forensic analysts, communications that show James monitoring Crystal, questioning her movements, accusing her of betrayal without proof. Then they bring in the confession. Not the version James told himself, but the version recorded. Jurors hear his voice as he talks about love while describing violence. They hear how quickly affection turns into justification, how easily he explains choking someone he claimed to care about. The contrast is unsettling. Medical experts testify next. They acknowledge James' mental health struggles, but they dismantle the defense piece by piece. They explain the difference between emotional instability and criminal responsibility, between impulsive anger and deliberate action. And the burial becomes the turning point. Prosecutors walk the jury through it slowly. The transportation of the body, the choice of location, the concealment, the rock, the flowers. Each step is framed as a decision. Each decision as proof of awareness. James watches as the story unfolds without him. His attorneys object occasionally, but the momentum is unmistakable. This isn't chaos. This is structure. For the first time, James is forced into silence. And that silence reveals something critical. When Crystal's name is spoken, the courtroom stills. Family members sit rigid. Friends look down. Jurors lean forward. But when James' name is spoken, the air shifts differently. Not with sympathy, but with scrutiny. The prosecution closes by reframing everything James tried to distort. This was not a crime of passion. This was not an uncontrollable episode. This was not love gone wrong. This was power. Power taken when control slipped. Power enforced when obedience failed. Power exercised to silence someone permanently. By the time the state rests its case, the question is no longer if James is responsible. It's whether there is any room left for doubt. And as the courtroom adjourns for the day, James finally realizes what Crystal likely understood far too late. Once the truth is told, clearly, there is nowhere left to hide.
The last story he tried to tell.
By the time the defense stands to present its case, the atmosphere in the courtroom has changed. The story has already been told, clearly, carefully, and without emotion. The prosecution has laid it out piece by piece, stripping away every layer James once hid behind. And now, the defense is left with a difficult task. They don't need to prove innocence. They just need to introduce doubt. From the start, their approach is noticeably different. Where the prosecution was measured and methodical, the defense leans into feeling, into tone, into interpretation. They talk about James' childhood, his instability, his troubled relationships. They describe him as a man who never learned how to regulate emotion, who loved too intensely, who reacted instead of reflected. They ask the jury to see him not as a predator, but as a flawed human being who reached a breaking point. Mental illness returns to center stage. Experts called by the defense acknowledge that James understood his actions, but argue that understanding doesn't mean control. That emotional dysregulation can narrow perception. That intense jealousy and fear of abandonment can distort reality. But even as they speak, there is a quiet problem they can't overcome. The evidence doesn't move. Because no matter how the defense reframes James' emotions, the actions remain the same. The choking, the silence, the transport, the burial, the concealment. And jurors are not being asked how James felt. They're being asked what he did. James himself does not testify. And that decision speaks louder than anything the defense can say. Had he taken the stand, he would have faced questions he couldn't control. Questions about timing, about choices, about why love only appeared in his story after violence. So instead he watches. He watches as his attorneys argue that this was not who he really is. That this was an anomaly, a collapse, a singular tragedy. But the prosecution has already shown otherwise. In cross-examination, defense witnesses are pressed gently but firmly. Past incidents resurface. Prior restraining orders. Patterns of escalation. Moments where James regained control only after asserting dominance. The defense tries to soften the edges. But the edges don't blur. As closing arguments approach, the jury has now heard two versions of the same events. One told with emotion. One told with evidence. The prosecution's rebuttal is brief and devastating. They don't attack James' character. They don't mock the defense's arguments. They simply return to the timeline. They remind the jury that fear does not explain burial. That illness does not explain concealment. That love does not explain silence. They remind them that Crystal never got to tell her story. That the only reason James' emotions are being discussed at all is because he lived and she did not. When the jury is finally instructed and dismissed to deliberate, James remains seated. Still. Expressionless. For the first time since the night Crystal disappeared, he has no role left to play. No story left to tell. And as the courtroom empties, one truth lingers heavier than any argument made that day. The defense didn't fail because they lacked compassion. They failed because compassion cannot erase choice.
12 people, one decision.
When the jury files into the deliberation room, the door closes softly behind them. No cameras. No audience. No voices but their own. 12 people now carry the weight of a life taken and the responsibility of deciding what that loss means under the law. At first, the room is silent. Some jurors avoid eye contact. Others flip through notes they've already memorized. A few stare straight ahead, replaying moments from the trial they didn't realize had stayed with them so deeply. The foreperson finally speaks, not to argue, but to ground the room. They begin where the court told them to begin, with the facts. They review the evidence carefully. The confession, the medical testimony, the timeline, the burial, the intent. They talk through it slowly, deliberately, stripping emotion away, not because Crystal's life didn't matter, but because emotion cannot guide the verdict. Still, it finds its way in. One juror, mentions the moment James described the choking so casually. Another recalls the rock placed on the grave, not as panic, but as punctuation. Someone else talks about the flowers and how disturbing it felt that care only appeared after Crystal was already gone. There is discussion. There are questions. There is disagreement, but not about what happened, only about how quickly certainty settles. Some jurors want to go over everything again, just to be sure. Others already feel the weight of the answer pressing down on them. And through it all, one thing becomes clear. The defense did not leave them with doubt. It left them with sadness. Sadness for a man who could not control his need for power. Sadness for a system that saw warning signs too late. Sadness for a woman who never got a chance to escape. But sadness is not uncertainty. And it is not innocence. When the final vote is taken, it does not take long. The decision is unanimous. Back in the courtroom, time stretches. James sits at the defense table, posture stiff, eyes fixed forward. His attorneys whisper quietly, but he barely responds. He has spent his entire life bracing for consequences and avoiding them. This time, there is nowhere to divert the outcome. When the jury returns, the room rises. Crystal's family stands together. Some hold hands. Some close their eyes. No one speaks. The verdict is read. Guilty. The word lands without drama. No gasp. No outburst. Just a quiet, irreversible shift. James does not react the way people expect. There is no collapse. No tears. No visible anger. Only stillness. As if somewhere deep inside, he knew this moment was coming and had run out of stories to delay it. For Crystal's family, there is no relief. No sense of victory. Only a confirmation of something they already knew, and a grief that now has a name attached to it. The judge thanks the jury for their service. But what they've done cannot be undone. They have spoken for someone who no longer can. And as the courtroom empties once more, the case moves into its final phase. Sentencing. Where the question will no longer be what happened, but how long the consequences should last.
When the story finally ends.
Sentencing does not arrive with the drama people expect. There is no chaos. No shouting. No sudden revelations. Just a quiet room, filled with the understanding that nothing said here will change what already happened. James Hunter Stallard enters the courtroom in restraints. For the first time since his arrest, there is no attempt to perform. No exaggerated emotion. No narrative to control. He takes a seat and waits. Across the room, Crystal's family sits together once more. They have already lived the worst part of the story. Today is not about punishment, it's about acknowledgement. The judge begins by summarizing the case. The facts. The verdict. The responsibility now placed in the court's hands. The tone is neutral, deliberate, restrained. Because sentencing is not about anger. It's about consequence. Victim impact statements come first. Crystal's loved ones stand one by one. Some speak with steady voices. Others struggle. They talk about who Crystal was beyond the crime. A mother. A friend. Someone who laughed loudly. Someone who tried to see the best in people, even when it cost her everything. They talk about the empty chair at family gatherings. The phone that no longer rings. The weight of knowing she was afraid and couldn't get away. James does not look at them. He stares straight ahead. When given the chance to speak, James rises slowly. And for a moment it feels like he might try again. Like he might tell one last story. But he doesn't. He offers a short apology. Carefully worded. Vague. Focused on loss, but never ownership. He says he's sorry for the pain. Sorry for how things ended. Sorry that everyone is hurting. He never says Crystal's name. The judge listens, then responds. They speak about responsibility. About how mental illness was considered, but did not outweigh intent. About how control was present. About how the crime did not end with violence, but continued through concealment. Then the sentence is handed down. Decades. Years measured not just in time, but in absence. James absorbs it without reaction. The gavel falls. And just like that, the story is officially over. But outside the courtroom, life doesn't pause. Crystal's family leaves together. Cameras flash briefly, then fade. They return to a world that has learned her name only through tragedy. James is led away, to a place where control no longer belongs to him. And the forest where Crystal was buried grows quiet again. Leaves fall. Seasons change. The ground settles. What remains is not closure. It is memory. A reminder of how easily control can masquerade as love. How silence can hide danger. How patterns ignored become tragedies repeated. And most of all, a reminder that Crystal was more than the way her story ended. She was a life, and she deserved to be remembered that way.
If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. Not for the algorithm, but so the victims are remembered, and the truth keeps getting told.